These are quite hilarious vignettes of the real Joseph Smith as written by the Recollections of Josiah Quincy. Yes, I find it frustrating that the real history of the Mormon movement has been reduced down to the sexual phenomenon of polygamy. They have smeared Joseph Smith's real historical contribution to the United States and the anti-slavery movement. This is why I find Josiah Quincy a venerable politician and emissary that went to visit Joseph Smith in Nauvoo. That's how important Joseph Smith was. They visited him, and Charles Adams, the son of John Quincy Adams, visited him to determine where the Mormon vote was going to be thrown. Even though Joseph Smith had thrown his hat into the political arena for president, he was using it as a third-party candidate. He was waiting to see which candidate was going to give the Mormon movement their political influence so they could continue to have the auspices and the blessing of the United States government. This history is completely obscured. Now, what's funny is Governor Ford is looked upon as a villain by Brighamites, but Governor Ford was a friend to Joseph Smith. He had to act at arm's length, but he definitely was influential in providing safe haven for the Mormon movement that had been thrown in a violent manner out of Missouri for inviting interracial Mormons to join their community. It was all based on the racial conflict leading up to the Civil War. And this was the true story of Mormonism. It was an interracial community based on Native American members, plenty of them. Joseph Smith's cousins were half Winnebago Indians. His aunt was full Winnebago. And of course, Solomon Mack was full Sephardic North African Jew. So, as you can see, Joseph Smith's family was multiracial and multicultural, not like Brigham Young, who was basically a toady for the British oligarchy who was trying to overthrow the United States. So let's just listen to Josiah Quincy's Recollections.
Josiah Quincy's Recollections. It was on the 25th of April, 1844, that Mr. Adams and myself left Boston for the journey to the West, which we had had for some time in contemplation. I omit all account of our adventures, and a very full account of them is before me, until the 14th of May, when we are ascending the clear, sparkling waters of the upper Mississippi in the little steamboat Amaranth. With one exception, we find our fellow passengers uninteresting. The exception is Dr. Goforth. A chivalric yet simple personage is this same doctor, who has served under General Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans and is now going to Nauvoo to promote the election of the just nominated Henry Clay. It is to this gentleman we owe our sight of the City of the Saints, which, strangely enough, we had not intended to visit. Though far from being a Mormon himself, Dr. Goforth told us much that was good and interesting about this strange people. He urged us to see for ourselves the result of the singular political system which had been fastened upon Christianity, and to make the acquaintance of his friend, General Smith, the religious and civil autocrat of the community. We agreed to stop at Nauvoo, says my journal, provided some conveyance should be found at the landing which would take us up to General Smith's tavern, and prepared our baggage for this contingency. Owing to various delays, we did not reach the landing till nearly midnight, when our friend, who had jumped on shore the moment the boat stopped, returned with the intelligence that no carriage was to be had, and so we bade him adieu to go on our way. But, as we still lingered upon the hurricane deck, he shouted that there was a house on the landing where we could get a good bed. This changed our destiny, and just at the last moment we hurried on shore. Here we found that the good bed our friend had promised us was in an old mill, which had been converted into an Irish shanty. However, we made the best of it, and having dispossessed a cat and a small army of cockroaches of their quarters on the coverlet, we lay down in our dressing gowns and were soon asleep. We left our lowly bed in the gray light of the morning, to find the rain descending in torrents and the roads knee-deep in mud. Intelligence of our arrival had in some mysterious manner reached General Smith, and the prophet's own chariot, a comfortable carryall drawn by 2 horses, soon made its appearance. It is probable that we owed the alacrity with which we were served to an odd blunder, which had combined our names and personalities, and set forth that no less a man than ex-President John Quincy Adams had arrived to visit Mr. Josph Smith. Happily, however, Dr. Goforth, who had got upon the road before us, divided our persons and reduced them to their proper proportions, so that no trace of disappointment was visible in the group of rough-looking Mormons who awaited our descent at the door of the tavern. It was a 3-story frame house, set back from the street and surrounded by a white fence, that we had reached after about 2 miles of the muddiest driving. Preeminent among the stragglers by the door stood a man of commanding appearance, clad in the costume of a journeyman carpenter when about his work. He was a hardy, athletic fellow, with blue eyes standing prominently out upon his light complexion, a long nose, and a retreating forehead. He wore striped pantaloons, a linen jacket, which had not lately seen the wash-tub, and a beard of some 3 days' growth. This was the founder of the religion which had been preached in every quarter of the earth. As Dr. Goforth introduced us to the prophet, he mentioned the parentage of my companion. CX. "God bless you to begin with," said Josph Smith, raising his hands in the air and letting them descend upon the shoulders of Mr. Adams. The benediction, though evidently sincere, had an odd savor of what may be called official familiarity, such as a crowned head might adopt on receiving the air presumptive of a friendly court. The greeting to me was cordial, with that sort of cordiality with which the president of a college might welcome a deserving janitor, and a blessing formed no part of it. "And now come, both of you, into the house," said our host, as, suiting the action to the word, he ushered us across the threshold of his tavern. A fine-looking man is what the passer-by would instinctively have murmured upon meeting the remarkable individual who had fashioned the mold which was to shape the feelings of so many thousands of his fellow mortals. But Smith was more than this, and one could not resist the impression that capacity and resource were natural to his stalwart person. I have already mentioned the resemblance he bore to Elisha R. Potter of Rhode Island, whom I met in Washington in 1826. The likeness was not such as would be recognized in a picture, but rather one that would be felt in a grave emergency. Of all men I have met, these two seemed best endowed with that kingly faculty which directs, as by intrinsic right, the feeble or confused souls who are looking for guidance. This it is just to say with emphasis, for the reader will find so much that is puerile and even shocking in my report of the Skark, Gok, prophet's conversation, that he might never suspect the impression of rugged power that was given by the man. On the right hand, as we entered the house, was a small and very comfortless-looking bar-room, all the more comfortless, perchance, from its being a dry bar-room, as no spirituous liquors were permitted at Nauvoo. In apparent search for more private quarters, the prophet opened the door of a room on the left. He instantly shut it again, but not before I perceived that the obstacle to our entrance was its prior occupancy by a woman, in bed. He then ran upstairs, calling upon us to follow him, and throwing open a door in the 2nd story, disclosed 3 Mormons in 3 beds. This was not satisfactory, neither was the next chamber, which was found, on inspection, to contain 2 sleeping disciples. The 3rd attempt was somewhat more fortunate, for we had found a room which held but a single bed and a single sleeper. Into this apartment we were invited to enter. Our host immediately proceeded to the bed and drew the clothes well over the head of its occupant. He then called a man to make a fire and begged us to sit down. Smith then began to talk about himself and his people, as of course we encouraged him to do. He addressed his words to Mr. Adams oftener than to me, evidently thinking that this gentleman had or was likely to have political influence, which it was desirable to conciliate. Whether by subtle tact or happy accident, he introduced us to Mormonism as a secular institution and black with age, before stating its monstrous claims as a religious system. Polygamy, it must be remembered, formed no part of the alleged revelations upon which the social life at Nauvoo was based. Indeed, the recorded precepts of its prophet were utterly opposed to such a practice, and it is at least doubtful whether this barbarism was sanctioned by Smith. Let a man who has so much to answer for be allowed the full benefit of the doubt, and Mormonism, minus the spiritual wife system, had, as it has today, much that was interesting in its secular aspects. Its founder told us what he had accomplished and the terrible persecutions through which he had brought his people. He spoke with bitterness of outrages to which they had been subjected in Missouri, and implied that the wanton barbarities of his lawless enemies must one day be atoned for. He spoke of the industrial results of his autocracy in the holy city we were visiting, and of the extraordinary powers of its charter obtained through his friend, Governor Ford. The past had shown him that a military organization was necessary. He was now at the head of 3,000 men, equipped by the state of Illinois and belonging to its militia, and the saints were prepared to fight as well as to work. "I decided," said Smith, "that the commander of my troops ought to be a lieutenant general, and I was, of course, chosen to that position. I sent my certificate of election to Governor Ford, and received in return a commission of lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion and of the militia of the state of Illinois. Now, on examining the Constitution of the United States, I find that an officer must be tried by a court-martial composed of his equals in rank, and as I am the only lieutenant general in the country, I think they will find it pretty hard to try me." At this point, breakfast was announced, and a substantial meal was served in a long back kitchen. We sat down with about 30 persons, some of them being in their shirt sleeves as if just come from work. There was no going out, as the rain still fell in torrents, and so when we had finished breakfast, the prophet, who had exchanged his working dress for a broadcloth suit while we lingered at the table, proposed to return to the chamber we had quitted, where he would give us his views of theology. The bed had been made during our absence, and the fire plentifully replenished. Our party was now increased by the presence of the patriarch, Hiram Smith, Dr. Richards of Philadelphia, who seemed to be a very modest and respectable Mormon, Dr. Goforth, and a Methodist minister, whose name I have not preserved. No sooner were we seated than there entered some half-dozen leaders of the sect, among whom, I think, were Rigdon and Young, but of their presence I cannot be positive. These men constituted a sort of silent chorus during the expositions of their chief. They fixed a searching yet furtive gaze upon Mr. Adams and myself, as if eager to discover how we were impressed by what we heard. Of the wild talk that we listened to, I have preserved but a few fragments. Smith was Gordon Gore, 385, well versed in the letter of the Scriptures, though he had little comprehension of their spirit. He began by denying the doctrine of the Trinity, and supported his views by the glib recitation of a number of texts. From this he passed to his own claims to special inspiration, quoting with great emphasis the 11th and 12th verses of the 4th chapter of Ephesians, which, in his eyes, adumbrated the whole Mormon hierarchy. The degrees and orders of ecclesiastical dignitaries he set forth with great precision, being careful to mention the interesting revelation which placed Josph Smith supreme above them all. This information was plentifully besprinkled with cant phrases or homely proverbs. There I have proved that point as straight as a loon's leg. The curses of my enemies run off from me like water from a duck's back. Such are the specimens which my journal happens to preserve, but the exposition was constantly garnished with forcible vulgarisms of a similar sort. The prophet referred to his miraculous gift of understanding all languages, and took down a Bible in various tongues, for the purpose of exhibiting his accomplishments in this particular. Our position as guests prevented our testing his powers by a rigid examination, and the rendering of a few familiar texts seemed to be accepted by his followers as a triumphant demonstration of his abilities. It may have been an accident, but I observed that the bulk of his translations were from the Hebrew, which, presumably, his visitors did not understand, rather, warling, than from the classical languages, in which they might more easily have caught him tripping. "And now come with me," said the prophet, "and I will show you the curiosities." So saying, he led the way to a lower room where sat a venerable and respectable-looking lady. "This is my mother, gentlemen. The curiosities we shall see belong to her. They were purchased with her own money at a cost of $6,000. And then, with deep feeling, were added the words, 'And that woman was turned out upon the prairie in the dead of night by a mob.' There were some pine presses fixed against the wall of the room. These receptacles Smith opened and disclosed 4 human bodies, shrunken and black with age. 'These are mummies,' said the exhibitor. 'I want you to look at that little runt of a fellow over there. He was a great man in his day. Why, that was Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt.' Some parchments inscribed with hieroglyphics were then offered us. They were preserved under glass and handled with great respect. 'That is the handwriting of Abraham, the father of the faithful,' said the prophet. 'This is the autograph of Moses, and these lines were written by his brother Aaron. Here we have the earliest account of the creation, from which Moses composed the first book of Genesis.' The parchment last referred to showed a rude drawing of a man and woman, and a serpent walking upon a pair of legs. I ventured to doubt the propriety of providing the reptile in question with this unusual means of locomotion. 387. "Why, that's as plain as a pikestaff," was the rejoinder. "Before the fall, snakes always went about on legs, just like chickens. They were deprived of them, in punishment for their agency in the ruin of man."
We were further assured that the prophet was the only mortal who could translate these mysterious writings, and that his power was given by direct inspiration. It is well known that Josph Smith was accustomed to make his revelations point to those sturdy business habits which lead to prosperity in this present life. He had little enough of that unmixed spiritual power which flashed out from the spare, neurasthenic body of Andrew Jackson. The prophet's hold upon you seemed to come from the balance and harmony of temperament which reposes upon a large physical basis. No association with the sacred phrases of Scripture could keep the inspirations of this man from getting down upon the hard pan of practical affairs. "Verily I say unto you, let my servant, Sidney Gilbert, plant himself in this place and establish a store." So had run one of his revelations, in which no holier spirit than that of commerce is discernible. The exhibition of these august relics concluded with a similar descent into the hard modern world of fact. Monarchs, patriarchs, and parchments were very well in their way, but this was clearly the 19th century, when prophets must get a living and provide for their relations. "Gentlemen," said this bourgeois Muhammad, as he closed the cabinets, "those who see these curiosities generally pay my mother $0.25. 2. The clouds had parted when we emerged from the Chamber of Curiosities, and there was time to see the temple before dinner. General Smith ordered a capacious carriage, and we drove to that beautiful eminence, bounded on 3 sides by the Mississippi, which was covered by the holy city of Nauvoo. The curve in the river enclosed a position lovely enough to furnish a site for the utopian communities of Plato or Sir Thomas More, and here was an orderly city, magnificently laid out, and teeming with activity and enterprise. And all the diligent workers, who had reared these handsome stores and comfortable dwellings, bowed in subjection to the man to whose unexampled absurdities we had listened that morning. Not quite unexampled either. For many years I held a trusteeship which required me to be a frequent visitor at the McLean Asylum for the Insane. I had talked with some of its unhappy inmates, victims of the sad but not uncommon delusion that each had received the appointment of vicegerent of the deity upon earth. It is well known that such unfortunates, if asked to explain their confinement, have a ready reply. "I am sane. The rest of the world is mad, and the majority is against me." It was like a dream to find oneself moving through a prosperous community, where the repulsive claim of one of these pretenders was respectfully acknowledged. It was said that Prince Hamlet had no need to recover his wits when he was dispatched to England, for the demented denizens of that island would never detect his infirmity. If the blasphemous assumptions of Smith seemed like the ravings of a lunatic, he had, at least, brought them to a market where all the people were as mad as he. Near the entrance to the temple we passed a workman who was laboring upon a huge sun, which he had chiseled from the solid rock. The countenance was of the Negro type, and it was surrounded by the conventional rays. "General Smith," said the man, looking up from his task, "is this like the face you saw in vision?" "Very near it," answered the prophet, except this was added with an air of careful connoisseurship that was quite overpowering. Except that the nose is just a thought too broad. The Mormon temple was not fully completed. It was a wonderful structure, altogether indescribable by me. Being, presumably, like something Smith had seen in a vision, it certainly cannot be compared to any ecclesiastical building which may be discerned by the natural eyesight. It was built of limestone, and was partially supported by huge monolithic pillars, each costing, said the prophet, $3,000. Then in the basement was the baptistry, which centered in a mighty tank, surrounded by 12 wooden oxen of colossal size. These animals, we were assured, were temporary. They were to be replaced by stone oxen as fast as they could be made. The temple, odd and striking as it was, produced no effect that was commensurate with its cost. Perhaps have required a genius to have designed anything worthy of that noble sight. The city of Nauvoo, with its wide streets sloping gracefully to the farms enclosed on the prairie, seemed to be a better temple to him who prospers the work of industrious hands than the grotesque structure on the hill, with all its queer carvings of moons and suns. This, however, was by no means the opinion of the man whose fiat had reared the building. In a tone halfway between jest and earnest, and which might have been taken for either at the option of the hearer, the prophet put this inquiry: "Is not here one greater than Solomon, who built a temple with the treasures of his father David and with the assistance of Hiram, king of Tyre? Josph Smith has built his temple with no one to aid him in the work." On returning to the tavern, dinner was served in the kitchen where we had breakfasted. The prophet carved at one end of the board, while some 20 persons, Mormons or travelers, the former mostly coatless, were scattered along its sides. At the close of a substantial meal, a message was brought to the effect that the United States Marshal had arrived and wished to speak to Mr. Adams. This officer, as it turned out, wanted my companion's advice about the capture of some criminal, for whom he had a warrant. The matter was one of some difficulty, for, the prophet being absolute in Nauvoo, no man could be arrested or held without his permission. I do not remember what was the outcome of this interview, which was so protracted that it caused Mr. Adams to miss one of the most notable exhibitions of the day. "General Smith," said Dr. Goforth, when we had adjourned to the green in front of the tavern, "I think Mr. Quincy would like to hear you preach." "Then I shall be happy to do so," was the obliging reply, and mounting the broad step which led from the house, the prophet promptly addressed a sermon to the little group about him. Our numbers were constantly increased from the passers in the street, and a most attentive audience of more than 100 persons soon hung upon every word of the speaker. The text was Mark 16:15, and the comments, though rambling and disconnected, were delivered with the fluency and fervor of a camp meeting orator. The discourse was interrupted several times by the Methodist minister before referred to, who thought it incumbent upon him to question the soundness of certain theological positions maintained by the speaker. One specimen of the sparring which ensued I thought worth setting down. The prophet is asserting that baptism for the remission of sins is essential for salvation. Minister: "Stop. What do you say to the case of the penitent thief?" Prophet: "What do you mean by that?" Minister: "You know our Savior said to the thief, 'This day shalt thou be with me in paradise,' which shows he could not have been baptized before his admission." Prophet: "How do you know he wasn't baptized before he became a thief?" At this retort the sort of laugh that is provoked by an unexpected hit ran through the audience. Underscore 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 underscore. But this demonstration of sympathy was rebuked by a severe look from Smith, who went on to say, "But that is not the true answer. In the original Greek, as this gentleman, turning to me, will inform you, the word that has been translated paradise means simply a place of departed spirits. To that place the penitent thief was conveyed, and there, doubtless, he received the baptism necessary for his admission to the heavenly kingdom." The other objections of his antagonist were parried with a similar adroitness, and in about 15 minutes the prophet concluded a sermon which it was evident that his disciples had heard with the heartiest satisfaction. In the afternoon we drove to visit the farms upon the prairie which this enterprising people had enclosed and were cultivating with every appearance of success. On returning, we stopped in a beautiful grove, where there were seats and a platform for speaking. "When the weather permits," said Smith, "we hold our services in this place, but shall cease to do so when the temple is finished." "I suppose none but Mormon preachers are allowed in Nauvoo," said the Methodist minister, who had accompanied our expedition. "On the contrary," replied the prophet, "I shall be very happy to have you address my people next Sunday, and I will ensure you a most attentive congregation." "What? Do you mean that I may say anything I please and that you will make no reply?" "You may certainly say anything you please, but I must reserve the right of adding a word or two if I judge best. I promise to speak of you in the most respectful manner." As we rode back, there was more dispute between the minister and Smith. "Come," said the latter, suddenly slapping his antagonist on the knee, to emphasize the production of a triumphant text. "If you can't argue better than that, you shall say all you want to say to my people, and I will promise to hold my tongue, for there's not a Mormon among them who would need my assistance to answer you." Some back thrust was evidently required to pay for this, and the minister, soon after, having occasion to allude to some erroneous doctrine which I forget, suddenly exclaimed, "Why, I told my congregation the other Sunday that they might as well believe Joe Smith as such theology as that." "Did you say Joe Smith in a sermon?" inquired the person to whom the title had been applied. "Of course I did." "Why not?" The prophet's reply was given with a quiet superiority that was overwhelming. "Considering only the day and the place, it would have been more respectful to have said Lieutenant General Josph Smith." Clearly, the worthy minister was no match for the head of the Mormon Church. I have before me some relics of my visit to Nauvoo. Here is the Book of Mormon, bearing the autograph which its alleged discoverer and translator wrote, at my request, and here are some letters addressed to the same personage, which I came by strangely enough. I took them from a public basket of waste paper, which was placed for the service of the inmates of the tavern. 3 of these abandoned epistles I asked leave to keep as memorials of my visit, and no objection was made to my doing so. The most interesting of these letters is dated Manchester, August 29, 1842, and comes from an English convert to Mormonism. The man writes 4 pages of gilt-edged paper to his beloved brother in the Lord, and sends him by the favor of Elder Snyder the following presents: a hat, a black satin stock with front, and a brooch. He would fain join the prophet in Nauvoo, but the way is blocked by that not unheard of obstacle, a mother-in-law, and until this excellent lady falls asleep, the disciple must deny his eyes the sight of the Master's face. The account of himself given by this correspondent shows with what pathetic sincerity the divine commission of Smith was accepted by a class of men which would seem to be intellectually superior to so miserable delusion. Suppressing the name of the writer, I shall give a portion of this letter, as it furnishes food for reflection, and shows that the secret of the Mormon prophet is not to be fathomed at a glance. "I take the liberty of writing a few lines, being assured that you are a man of God and a prophet of the Most High, not only from testimony given by the brethren, but the Spirit itself beareth witness. It is true that mine eyes have not seen and mine ears heard you, but the testimony I have received shows plainly that God does reveal by His Spirit things that the natural man has not seen by his natural eyes. You may perhaps wonder who the individual is that has written this letter. I will tell you, in a few words. My father died about 24 years since, leaving my mother a widow with 7 children. I remember her teachings well, which were these: fear God, be strictly honest, and speak the truth. I remember, when about 3 or 4 years old, being with her in a shop. I saw a pin on the floor. I picked it up and gave it to her. She told me to give it to the shopman, with a sharp reprimand, showing me that it was a sin to take even a pin. The remembrance of this slight circumstance has followed me from that time to the present. An account of the writer's conversion to Mormonism follows, after which he goes on thus. Previously to joining this church, I was a singer in the Church of England, had £8 a year, and a good situation in the week time at a retail hat shop. My wife's brother told me I was robbing my children of their bread in giving up the £8. I told him I was not dependent on that for bread, and said unto him the Lord could make up the difference. He laughed at me. But, beloved brother, in about 1 month from the time I left the Church of England, my master raised my wages 4 shillings a week, which was about 1 shilling per week more than that just sacrificed, and this has continued on ever since, which is now 2 years this month, for which I thank the Lord, together with many other mercies. I have quoted enough to show what really good material Smith managed to draw into his net. Were such fish to be caught with Spalding's tedious romance and a puerile fable of undecipherable gold plates and gigantic spectacles? Not these cheap and wretched properties, but some mastering force of the man who handled them, inspired the devoted missionaries who worked such wonders. The remaining letters, both written a year previous to my visit, came from a certain Chicago attorney, who seems to have been the personal friend as well as the legal advisor of the prophet. With the legal advice come warnings of plots which enemies are preparing, and of the probability that a seizure of his person by secret ambush is contemplated. They hate you, writes this friendly lawyer, because they have done evil unto you. My advice to you is not to sleep in your own house, but to have some place to sleep strongly guarded by your own friends, so that you can resist any sudden attempt that might be made to kidnap you in the night. When the Missourians come on this side and burn houses, depend upon it they will not hesitate to make the attempt to carry you away by force. Let me again caution you to be every moment upon your guard. The man to whom this letter was addressed had long been familiar with perils. For 14 years he was surrounded by vindictive enemies, who lost no opportunity to harass him. He was in danger even when we saw him at the summit of his prosperity, and he was soon to seal his testimony or, if you will, to expiate his imposture by death at the hands of dastardly assassins. If these letters go little way toward interpreting the man, they suggest that any hasty interpretation of him is inadequate. I should not say quite all that struck me about Smith if I did not mention that he seemed to have a keen sense of the humorous aspects of his position. It seems to me, General, I said, as he was driving us to the river, about sunset, that you have too much power to be safely trusted to one man. In your hands or that of any other person, was the reply. So much power would, no doubt, be dangerous. I am the only man in the world whom it would be safe to trust with it. Remember, I am a prophet. The last 5 words were spoken in a rich, comical aside, as if in hearty recognition of the ridiculous sound they might have in the ears of a Gentile. I asked him to test his powers by naming the successful candidate in the approaching presidential election. Well, I will prophesy that John Tyler will not be the next president, for some things are possible and some things are probable. But Tyler's election is either the one nor the other. We then went on to talk of politics. Smith recognized the curse and iniquity of slavery, though he opposed the methods of the abolitionists. His plan was for the nation to pay for the slaves from the sale of the public lands. Congress, he said, should be compelled to take this course by petitions from all parts of the country, but the petitioners must disclaim all alliance with those who would disturb the rights of property recognized by the Constitution and foment insurrection. It may be worthwhile to remark that Smith's plan was publicly advocated, 11 years later, by one who has mixed so much practical shrewdness with his lofty philosophy. In 1855, when men's minds had been moved to their depths on the question of slavery, Mr. Ralph Waldo Emerson declared that it should be met in accordance with the interest of the South and with the settled conscience of the North. It is not really a great task, a great fight for this country to accomplish, to buy that property of the planter, as the British nation bought the West Indian slaves. He further says that the United States will be brought to give every inch of their public lands for a purpose like this. We, who can look back upon the terrible cost of the fratricidal war which put an end to slavery, now say that such a solution of the difficulty would have been worthy a Christian statesman. But if the retired scholar was in advance of his time when he advocated this disposition of the public property in 1855, what shall I say of the political and religious leader who had committed himself, in print, as well as in conversation, to the same course in 1844? If the atmosphere of men's opinions was stirred by such a proposition when war clouds were discernible in the sky, was it not a statesmanlike word 11 years earlier, when the heavens looked tranquil and beneficent? General Smith proceeded to unfold still further his views upon politics. He denounced the Missouri Compromise as an unjustifiable concession for the benefit of slavery. It was Henry Clay's bid for the presidency. Dr. Goforth might have spared himself the trouble of coming to Nauvoo to electioneer for a duelist who would fire at John Randolph.